really was interested in this topic of Eastern psychology, primarily because before I started my master's degree, I was already a meditation teacher. And that was sort of my link to the human mind, I think. So going from there to the field of psychology, which especially today is highly influenced. I mean, the topic of mindfulness, yoga, these type of topics for both physical and mental health and well-being are the most studied topics in the field right now. And just about everyone is prescribing mindfulness practices, right? So the real question is, so we're in an age of prosperity, right? Everyone knows, actually, human wealth as a totality is at the highest it's ever been in history. So there's abundance. And you think about it, compared to any other time, right? The human population up till about the 1800s, that's pre the modern era, was always vacillating around 1 billion people. Shortly after the 1800s, with the onset of modern science, right, mortality rates dropped, tremendously, right? Famine, vaccinations, all the modern technologies we have today have made life for human beings actually better than it's ever been. So as a species, we are actually doing better than we've ever been doing in recorded history. And yet, the rates of suffering, depression, suicide are still increasing. So on the one hand, technology has helped us with survival. On the other hand, it hasn't addressed another issue, the human mind. And this is why I sort of, I think there was a little intro to this that I wrote, and I said, one of the answers comes from India, which experienced similar difficulties in its past, meaning it rose thousands of years ago to a fairly technologically advanced, fairly stable agrarian society. At which point, people still had the question of, okay, well now society's stable, wealth is stable, my survival is almost ensured, but why am I still suffering, right? So why suffering still exists? And so that leads into, oh, that's much better. Maybe just, okay. That leads into what we call the Eastern perspective. So, if you go back to the Upanishads, or Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or the journey of the Buddha, right? So when I take a look at the journey of the Buddha, really it's a journey, the fundamental question he was asking, because, for those who don't know the story, so Buddha was very sheltered as a child, right? Quite a few people are nodding their heads, those who haven't heard the story. So his father did not want him to become a monk, so he said, I'm going to shelter this child from any suffering, so not allow him outside the walls of the palace. So one day he decides on his own that he needs to go out. He talks to the charioteer, and he takes a journey around the kingdom. And lo and behold, what does he see? He sees a person who's not looking well, shivering, and he asks the charioteer, what's that? He says, oh, that person is sick. He's like, what's that? Oh, occasionally you get illnesses, and illnesses result in your body not reacting well, and you suffer. Oh, do princes get sick as well? The charioteer responded, yes, princes get sick as well, Then he continued on this journey, and he saw a person who was old, infirm, having difficulty walking. He says, "What's that?" And he said, "That's someone who's old." "What's old?" Because we've never seen an old person before that, I guess. And he says, "That's someone, after you age, your body deteriorates, and then you become like that." And he's thinking, does that happen to me as well? The existential question really hits Buddha at that point. Is, so, am I also going to get old? And of course the charioteer responds, yeah, of course, obviously, right? It seemed very obvious to him. Then he continues on the journey, and he sees a funeral procession, right? You see, in India, you carry the dead body on the shoulders, and you carry it to the ghat, right, where it's going to be eventually burned. And he's like, "What's that?" He says, "That person, someone just died." "Died? What's that?" He says, "Well, eventually, everyone dies. Life ends," right? It's like, oh wow. So this was a big, you could say, insightful moment in the Buddha's life. So he started looking, so what is there that doesn't end? What is there that provides freedom from suffering? So Buddha was very much concerned with freedom from suffering. Additionally, if I go back to Patanjali studied the human mind, again, the human condition. And Patanjali looked at what is the root cause of suffering. So do the Upanishads. In fact, so does the Gita. And it all boils down to this wonderful capacity of the human mind. But understanding the mind. So from an Eastern perspective, and we've heard this, so mind is not brain. Mind, from an Eastern perspective, conceptually, so I'm trying to make the concept of mind clear for those who don't understand it. From an Eastern perspective, mind is simply the movement of thoughts, or the cognitive aspect of the brain, you could say. The brain is an organ, a physiological organ, serves many functions, right? The cognitive aspect is what, from an Eastern perspective, we call mind. And this mind is a powerful tool. It's very powerful because of language. So language is what essentially allows human technology to exist. If you take a look at it, no other creature on this planet has the ability to communicate knowledge generationally, right? This is what we do. I've got books, right? You have books. We studied in school. Now we study in school for probably a good 15 to 20 years of our life so that we can learn something in a certain amount of depth, right? That transfer of knowledge allows for the development of technology. It's how all of this exists, right? If we did not have language, this would not be possible. However, the mind is a powerful tool. It's also wired for survival. Why? Because when the human mind was created, and for most of human history, survival was very important. Survival, for example, your problem-solving mind works very well if you're lost in the woods. And the first thing you start to look for is, it's going to get night, right? The worries come, but it's cognitive problem-solving, right? It's going to get cold at night. How do I find shelter? Where do I find food? How do I get out of here? How do I contact someone, right? It provides attention and problem-solving capacity. It's a wonderful tool. Actually, it's one of the greatest gifts for human beings. On the other hand, when the problem-solving tool is sort of not minded, when we talk about mindfulness and the importance of mindfulness, if you don't mind your tool, it develops an interesting life of its own. And it tends to always, because survival is always related to suffering, it tends to push you into a state of suffering, if not minded. And this, so this is where these practices came in, with these ideas of meditation. It's like, so do I really need to listen to everything my mind says? Is what is going on in my mind actually very important at this moment? Is it important to what's going on? Or is it just a lot of noise? Is it problem solving gone wild, right? And if you ever notice when you're stressed, right, and we know this age-old wisdom, right? When people are stressed, we say, don't make any hasty decisions, right? This is like across cultures, we say that, right? You're angry, don't do anything, right? We tell people if you're angry. Because when you're angry, all your focus comes to one point, and that is survival, right? That survival instinct kicks in. The higher order functioning, right, what we call, in Gita describes anger, very smriti brahmsha, buddhi nasha, right? First it becomes confusion, right? From that anger, buddhi nasha pranashchati. Says if you follow this line, right, that means you get angry and then you hit someone, you kill someone, right? Pranashchati, that's the extreme example, right? It is the self-destructive. Smriti brahmsha, buddhi nasha, pranashchati. So it understood that when the mind goes into these states of survival, if not minded with wisdom, the outcome for human beings is not so good. One of the greatest capacities when we talk about mindfulness is the capacity to simply observe without judgment. So that I can sit, right? I can sit and simply observe. So that's one. The other aspect is, as I observe the mind, I also realize that I'm not mind. Because the simple act of observing means I'm something more primary, right? The simple act of observing means I'm not that which is being observed, right? So I'm not my thoughts and my feelings. In fact, the fundamental flaw in what we call the age of reason came from René Descartes. Everyone's heard René Descartes, right? René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. He missed the boat. He should have studied the Upanishads, but they weren't available to him at the time. They didn't come till much later to Europe. But it's actually, I think and I am, right? They both exist simultaneously. And this is what we call Maya or Avidya, depending on, so I've had some discussions with Staneshwarji. He doesn't like me using the term Maya as much because he says that's a Buddhist term. He says you should be using Avidya. And in the Upanishads, Avidya is kind of used interchangeably that way, meaning the idea in the Upanishads is, what is ignorance? Ignorance is, in the story of the person sleeping in the room, right? So you're sleeping in the room and he sees something coiled up in the corner. He cannot sleep the entire night because he thinks it's a snake. And he's planning the whole night, how can I possibly kill the snake or run away, right? Survival instinct, right? The mind doing what it does, solving problems that don't exist, right? 90% of the time. So, he's not getting a good night's sleep. Then, of course, dawn comes, and then he sees it's just a rope. So this is the idea behind avidya is because I lack knowledge, because I lack the wisdom to manage my mind, sometimes I go crazy. And we all go crazy. right? That's part of our humanity. So learning that wisdom, developing that wisdom. So I can show it from the standpoint of what, it's an interesting little plot in it, but how the mind perceives reality, or how most of us actually perceive reality, is through the lens of ideas. So if you look at the mind is a conceptual tool. Everyone understands concepts? Ideas, right? So when I look out at the world, normally I'm looking out, then the information I get back is put through a bunch of memories, beliefs, ideas that are conceptual, and that translates into thinking and feeling. For example, let's say you're on a dark night, walking alone on the street. Then you see three young men walking on the street, being kind of loud, obnoxious. All of a sudden, fear kicks in, right? Your mind, memory says, oh, these guys might be gangbangers, right? I can be threatened, right? Similarly, if you see on that same street, you see a young lady walking, you don't feel threatened, right? Similarly, if you see, so as the environment changes and my ideas or concepts change, my reaction to the environment changes dependent on how it aligns with my beliefs, ideas, and concepts, right? This is Maya 101. This is what Maya is. The world is an illusion because we all believe we're right in our worldview, and for some reason everyone else won't agree with us. Right? It's kind of absurd, but everyone's worldview is their worldview. Everyone argues about their worldview, holds it very, a lot of times people hold it rigidly. The idea is actually in Eastern psychology not to hold it rigidly, allow it to change, allow it to adapt. Hold it loosely. Actually, I love the Zen teacher that I listen to a lot says there's an old Zen saying. Says there's no such thing as a true belief. When I heard that, I go, my God, that is such a powerful teaching because it teaches both the importance of language. Not that belief is unimportant, ideas and concepts are important, but it also shows the limitation of language. Another way to say it is, I can talk about water, I can think about water, I can dream about water, but I will not satisfy my thirst until I drink water, right? So the idea of water and what water really is totally different. The same way, and so if you start to think about all of the things, all of the many ailments we see today, like what we call racism, sexism, whatever we call it, we've got so many isms now, you know, and especially right now with the social media age where people are, in many ways, can become more rigid in their concepts because you can find a group of people that agree with you, right? It's called groupthink, right? So some people still believe Obama is not a citizen, but, you know, it is what it is, right? I'm sure there's a group out there that says that. So, but then what are you? So that's the real fundamental question of Eastern psychology. And that is, what am I? If I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings, I'm not my ideas, I'm not my concepts, what am I? What am I really? So that's kind of the question. And if I look at it, how do I know I'm not just my thoughts and feelings? My thoughts, feelings exist in the waking state. When I'm dreaming, they're all different. My dreams don't necessarily correspond to reality, right? When I'm in deep sleep, I don't think at all. There are no cognitive processes going on. There's no memories. And in a state of deep meditation, also, thoughts can be absent. Yet, I am. Something else is there, something that's more primal. And in fact, in some ways, and this is an aspect of where insight comes from. So in a lot of the insight-oriented therapies, the real trick is to get your client to slow down enough. So when a person is distressed, right, there's that movement going on. Now that person sits with someone else. In the process of simply sitting with someone else, that helps to slow down that person. The person becomes less agitated, right? Then the process of therapy, whatever techniques a particular therapist employs, or more importantly, just the human connection between a therapist and a client, or between friends, can sometimes slow down a person enough that they get their own insight, right? Basically, it moves them out of survival instinct into the normal thinking process where the prefrontal cortex is engaged, right? And now they can think more clearly, right? When you think more clearly, so this is a paradox, right? The paradox is, and this Patanjali discovered over I don't know how many thousand years ago. There's always a debate on time, but let's just say many thousand years ago, right? Many thousand years ago, Patanjali discovered that clarity comes from absence of thinking. And it's a paradox. It doesn't come necessarily by thinking. It can be expressed through thought, it can be expressed through language, but as the thoughts slow down, Patanjali describes it beautifully, elegantly. So he calls it like a pond, right? And he describes thoughts as vrittis, right? Sort of like the pond here, your memories and beliefs, the thoughts subside. Now, as that ripples decrease, you start to see the external environment with clarity. And we've all had those wonderful moments of clarity, right? A lot of times I'm a nature lover, so I love to go hiking. And so if you go out into the woods and you hike, and you just see the vastness of things, all of a sudden it puts everything into perspective. You're connected. You can see the connection. In fact, John Muir, one of the naturalists, right? Leading naturalist. Thank you for that. His connection was to nature. That again was connection. Connection is what transforms anyone. Connection, by the way, is what the definition of yoga is, right? So in Eastern psychology, what we try to do, now getting to a little bit of a practical level, is changing the relationship between mind thinking and what's going on. So essentially, if you look, and it works, for example, I can give you the example of vets with PTSD, right? Someone has come back from a combat zone. One of the biggest issues is excessive anxiety, hyper-awareness, right? It's because they came from a war zone. If you're in a war zone, being hyper-vigilant and aware is very good. You have to be extremely vigilant, very aware, very threatened at all times, very ready to take out your M16 and fire, right? However, now you're walking on the streets of, I don't know, Irvine. Nice little safe neighborhood, right? And yet, your body is still following that same pattern. That same psychological term would be schema. The Eastern term would be sanskara. Any habit that's repeated becomes a sanskara. The issue now is it's interfering with your life because you can't go out, you can't go to restaurants, you become more and more isolated. Because you're still threatened by that fear. The fear meant something then. So part of the approach is actually decatastrophizing the emotion. So I think I remember telling my veteran clients that, bullets can kill you, but your fear can't. Let's discover that. We're going to sit here. Sit. You can experience the fear. Let's see if it kills you. It's sort of it's a experiment with safety, of course. There's the connection there. You don't want someone to panic at that particular time. But at the same time, you have them just observe it without the thoughts. So this is actually a technique from Tantra. If you're distressed by an emotion, you want to actually seek the truth of that emotion. All these techniques are finding the truth, actually, in the emotion. It says, take your mind off the ideas or the object of fear and put it directly on the feeling of fear itself, as if it's the self itself. So hold it in a space of compassion. Sort of like that, I would almost say a loving curiosity would be the best term I've heard for it. Like the curiosity a child would have when it sees something new. Be curious about that emotion. And that sort of allows it to move naturally. So this is what helps to loosen some scars, right? And then as a result, people suffer less, right? I guess we could talk a little bit about loving kindness, forgiveness, and those practices. But I guess before I do that, I would like to ask if it's a lot of information I've sent out. Any questions so far?
One question. You told that we are thinking, so I am different from what my mind is thinking. I have a question that whether Western psychology also agrees with this concept or not, and if not, how would you like to resolve it?
So I'll say, not an expert in Western psychology, but I've studied different theories. Most of the time, actually, the emphasis in Western psychology, like cognitive behavioral theory, is to change the thinking process so it's more adaptive, less harmful. So, for example, in cognitive behavioral theory, what they would say is you have maladaptive and adaptive thought processes. Those are the two different types, they would say. What would be maladaptive, and they have certain keywords. Actually, it's very good for awareness. And that is certain things like, people should be like this. If you hear the word should be, then that's considered maladaptive thinking. My life should be like this. My wife should be like this. So it says that's not adaptive because it misses the point, right? It basically, these are thoughts that simply create suffering for you and others. So they would say, why don't we try to rewrite those thoughts in a more adaptive way? Which is like, so instead of should be, it's like, so what is actually the situation, right? It's kind of like, well, I'm upset and I'm upset, I feel upset, right? So owning the emotion. So that's one thing that is there even in Western psychology and Eastern now, is the recognition that you are the owner of your own emotional content. It is not someone else that's making you angry. No, their behavior may be bad. That's a whole different story, right? We're not condoning bad behavior. Someone else may be, but no one can make you angry. It is only you choose the response. Yeah?
I think after therapy example that I've come across is Vichar, or Mother Vichar. You see the Orthodox churches and all that. So when the mother sees a child that's crying, it's obviously distress. And the mother does not try to rationalize the Western way of Western psychology. All it does is hold the baby and just hold it with loving compassion, and the child is fine. So the same way you do that with your fear, anger, grief, you hold it like Alana will child. Yeah, this is it.
So, yeah, I will say though, having seen different therapists with different theories work, I think each theory, each therapist has their own unique, how do you say it, connection with that theory. It is that connection with that theory and the connection with the client that transforms the person. And so for that, different models are there. I'm not going to say one model is better. I think I personally align toward the Eastern model because I think it answers several other questions. And I think a lot of other schools of Western psychology, and I'll get to that actually in my presentation. Actually, I'll get to it now since have been influenced by Eastern thinking. So, some of you were around in the 60s, right? Everyone remembers well, I don't remember personally, but a lot of people may remember that during the 60s there was a lot of new ideas coming into America. And many Eastern teachers, mystics visited America during that time. Meditation and mindfulness actually became popular because the Beatles started meditating. And whatever the Beatles did, everybody did. So that was one thing that was said. And then it was also then medicine's first insight into the field of mind-body medicine. So up till that point, really, Western medicine didn't realize the mind-body connection. There was, the way I learned it in school, there's the autonomic nervous system and the voluntary nervous system. They don't really talk about they didn't talk about the connections between the two. And when they started to see that these, especially these Eastern yogis could come and actually almost stop their heart, bring it to such a slow respiratory rate that it would even mimic being dead, they began to see that somehow there is a connection between the autonomic nervous system and the voluntary nervous system, that maybe they're not as disconnected as they thought. And then a lot of the ideas of, for example, mindfulness, people like John Kabat-Zinn, right, started really doing some research on the topic. So after about 40 years of research now, the evidence is so overwhelming, everyone is adopting it. That's the wonderful thing about the West. If something works, everyone adopts it. That's a vibrancy in the culture, right? So I'll say that psychology changed during that period. There's something called rational emotive therapy, which is very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very popular. And Albert Ellis actually admitted in one of his books that his ideas for rational emotive therapy were based on Buddhist ideas. And meditation, mindfulness, components in mental health treatment. Probably the fastest growing evidence-based theory is acceptance commitment therapy. ACT is based on Buddhist psychology, and a lot of the techniques employed are based on Buddhist techniques. And of course, Eastern psychology has come in. The whole self-compassion, loving-kindness practices. Jack Kornfield and others, including the Dalai Lama, have sort of, been strong influences in this sort of side of things. So, coming to loving-kindness and forgiveness, right? These are probably some of the most powerful practices in I guess, powerful and practical. So, the idea is, mindfulness is looking upon something without judgment, right? Which, by the way, is difficult for most of us to do because we've been trained since childhood to judge everything, right? Wo aise hai, wo I'm this way, right? Guilt, shame, right? We know the cycle, right? In fact, many parents, and sometimes it's good, believe that guilt, shame is a good way to regulate and control children's behavior, right? In fact, most people use that to manipulate other people's behaviors, right? It's good at manipulation. It's not necessarily good at transformation. But transformation requires sort of a vulnerability. Like to accept that someone can change, but you can't control the way that person will change. It requires a tremendous amount of courage. See what I'm saying? See, in all of the Eastern psychological techniques, we're not trying to push forward a change agenda. So there may be therapeutic goals per se, but that's not central to the therapy, you could say. Central to the therapy is essentially allowing whatever is relevant to the client, very client-centered, which is very relevant to the consciousness of the individual, basically respecting that individual's autonomy, to sort itself out, right? So which all you're doing is creating an atmosphere. And if you look, that's essentially when people go into and meet saints, right? A lot of people have these transformative experiences in the fields of people who are, I would say, since we are as human beings, we have mirror neurons, right? We pick up on energy. We pick up on a person's mental state. For example, when a person is agitated, comes into a room, everyone can feel the agitation, right? When a person is calm, comes into a room, you feel the calm, right? Right? Parts of spirituality, I would say the impractical parts of spirituality, get stuck in the absolute state. So, absolute state people call Turiya and Nirvana. So everyone believes that at some point it's like the Nirvana, what do you call, vacation. You get this thing called Nirvana, all your problems disappear, there's, all of that happens, right? And yet, in most cases, that people who have a glimpse, that's not the case. They may have a glimpse, they may have huge glimpses, and yet certain aspects of their personality are still there, still very present, very alive, there's still conflict within them, and so what do you do at that point? So the more practical aspect, and actually, is not to get stuck in the absolute, because the absolute isn't the absolute truth. Emptiness isn't the full story. Emptiness expresses through humanness. That's the end of the story. See what I'm saying?
Can you repeat that?
Emptiness expresses through humanness.
Mind is still present.
So it gets embodied. So on the one hand, those people who are from the school of, you could say the absolute school, they say everything is illusion. There's the absolute. And there is a truth to that. We cannot deny that all of this is impermanent. I'm impermanent, you're impermanent. This lecture is very impermanent, right? All of this is impermanent. And so the only thing that is absolutely true, the absolute nature, is ever present. It's the unborn, right? It was there before I was born. It will be there after I'm born. It is timeless, right? So on the entire scale, it is timeless. That's the absolute. Yet, equally true is that the world exists, and it is embodied. And that there's this wonderful dance of consciousness that is here. And that aspect, that human aspect needs to be tended to as well. And that's why, especially in Kashmir Saivism or Tibetan Buddhism, there's an emphasis on loving kindness and forgiveness practices. So it's to tend to the humanness, really to basically, how does consciousness move? And the answer is really, the answer it tends to tend to is compassionately.
By emptiness, do you mean the absence of thought process, or what may be called shunyata in the Buddhist writing?
Shunyata or purna, both are expressions of the same. Because one can be empty of thought, and then one is full of consciousness. It is same, because the process is emptying. Because even in Upanishadic sayings, you are basically emptying out, neti, neti. Right? Not this, until that which is left is there. Only thing is, and that's a philosophical argument I don't want to get into, it's purna and shunya, and I don't really care. Actually, it's not important. It's important to philosophers, not to me. From a practical standpoint, whatever it is, you can call it emptiness, you can call it consciousness, you can call it purna, you can call it God, you can call it whatever you call it. But there's that which is permanent, that which is alive inside, right? And the qualities of it are Sat, Chit, and Ananda, right? This is what we've learned. But Sat, it's aligned with truth. It knows it cannot die, right? So it knows. Your mind doesn't know, but it knows. It's aligned with truth. Chit, it is conscious, it is intelligent, it moves in a certain way. Ananda, it's also blissful. Sometimes people get confused with that, oh, so that means it's a never-ending bliss for you. And I think that's also, I don't know, most of the, I'll just say it, most of it's BS. Understood by a conceptual model, that it wouldn't be alive. Similarly, if you were to be understood by any conceptual model, you would not be alive. Living beings, and even inanimate objects, cannot be fully understood through conceptual models. It doesn't mean the models don't serve a purpose. I have a degree in engineering. Models work. They serve a purpose. They're useful. I run EM field theory all the time, right? Very useful models to serve a purpose. But if you truly want to understand someone, you can't view them through their model. You have to connect to them directly. Right? So it's interesting. So look at your friend circle. Some of your friends may agree with you, but I have the pleasure of having friends that don't agree with me. That share totally different political views than I do. And yet there's a connection between us. So if I look at them as a model, which is, the current political theory, right? Those are guys are leftist. That person's a Hindu fundamentalist. That person's a racist, a misogynist, a feminist, right? We put labels. These are our conceptual models. They're very primitive conceptual models. And you'd think by now, after 2,000 years, we would get better, Maybe we should use polynomial equations to define. So there's the equation of feminism, so do a fourth order polynomial curve fit, and you say these polynomials define the feminist construct. Actually, some of the statistics in psychology attempt to do that as well, but those can be useful, good for marketing, but for connection, totally useless. Sometimes concepts can be useful to connect, but most of the time they tend to drive us away from each other. They put us back into a field of separation. I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, right? Now we are separate. Yet, the reality is there's no separation. And that's an obvious reality. I cannot sit here or stand here where I'm standing and physically be able to breathe only the air I'm breathing and not the air you're breathing. I share the same resources on the planet with you. We eat the same food. We throw stuff into the same rivers and oceans. We're all connected, right, on this planet. To say that we're separate, it's I would say, just a useful model. So separation, or the ego even, so people view the ego a lot of times as the enemy, but especially with love, the loving kindness and forgiveness aspects of it, the ego is not even considered the enemy. The ego is just doing what it does. It's trying to understand a world it can never comprehend. It's trying to make sense of things. It doesn't realize it's hopeless. So, from that standpoint, that compassion, that love sort of opens up the space. And so the rigidity starts to, so we call it, the psychological term for it is what mindfulness and these practices do is they develop what they call cognitive plasticity, right? So basically, consciousness is more plastic.